Most defendants would accept their fate without question, but when Pam Bondi found herself suddenly slapped with a fine, she responded so strategically that even the judge began to question his own decision. Pam Bondi never anticipated the events of that morning. Courtroom 3B in a Tampa courthouse was supposed to be just another quick stop, a brief hearing, nothing extraordinary. She had been in that room numerous times before, standing before judges with various levels of expertise, but nothing seemed unusual about today. Seated at the defendant's table, her expression neutral, Pam sifted through a few notes. Across from her, the city attorney adjusted his tie and shifted in his chair, waiting for the judge to enter. The case seemed trivial, a minor procedural issue that would take no more than 10 minutes, or so it appeared. However, when Judge Raymond Dalton entered the room, Pam immediately sensed that something was different. Dalton, a tall man with a graying beard and piercing eyes, exuded an authority that commanded the room without a word. Most judges would take their time to review the case files and acknowledge the attorneys before making any comments. Not Dalton. "Let's get started," he said, his tone flat, his face unreadable. Pam sat up slightly, sensing a change in the atmosphere. "The court has reviewed the matter," Dalton continued, "and after considering the arguments, I find the defendant in violation of Local Statute 14B. A fine of $10,000 is imposed, payable immediately." Silence fell. Pam's brow raised slightly, but inside her mind raced. She had expected a back and forth, perhaps some discussion or a warning, but this? A ruling without any discussion whatsoever? The city attorney glanced at her, looking almost apologetic. Even he hadn't anticipated such swift action. Pam remained calm, folding her hands, and her voice was steady. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we haven't even begun proceedings. I haven't been given the chance to present my arguments." Dalton didn't flinch. "The arguments are irrelevant. The violation is clear. The law is clear." Pam inhaled, slowly, maintaining a composed demeanor. The stillness in the room felt off. She wasn't the type to lose her composure, but something about this felt deliberate. This wasn't just a ruling, it was a statement. She studied Dalton's eyes, sensing a confidence that went beyond judicial authority. He wasn't merely adjudicating a case. He was trying to put her in her place. Her voice remained measured but firm. "If the law were truly that clear, we wouldn't be here, Your Honor. I request the opportunity to present my defense." Dalton leaned back slightly, as if anticipating her resistance. His lips curled into something that barely resembled a smile. "You're welcome to try, Ms. Bondi, but I assure you, the outcome will be the same." That's when she realized this wasn't just about the case. It was personal. Pam adjusted her papers in front of her, more for effect than anything else. The fine itself wasn't the issue. She had fought much bigger battles before. But the principle, this was something she couldn't let slide. She met Dalton's gaze, unwavering. "Then I suppose we should get started." The tension in the room thickened. The city attorney shifted uncomfortably. The court stenographer adjusted her position in her chair. Even some of the spectators in the back leaned forward, sensing the unfolding drama. Pam took one last glance at her legal brief, though she didn't need it. She already knew how she was going to proceed. Dalton thought he had the upper hand, but he was about to learn that this wasn't going to be as easy as he assumed. Before anyone could speak again, Pam raised her hand, an unspoken signal that she wasn't finished. What happened next would leave the entire courtroom stunned. Pam allowed the silence to stretch out, making sure it had an impact. She didn't rush, didn't waver. She simply turned one page in her folder, more for dramatic effect than necessity, before looking up at Judge Dalton. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and unwavering, "before I proceed, I'd like to clarify something." She waited for a moment before continuing. "Are you saying that the defense has no right to present arguments in a legal proceeding?" Dalton's face didn't change. "I'm saying the violation is clear, and the fine stands." Pam tilted her head slightly as though studying him. "Interesting." Dalton raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Pam leaned back a little, keeping her tone casual. It's just, I've been practicing law for many years, and in all that time, I've never encountered a judge who dismissed a defense without hearing a single word of it. It's, what's the term? Unprecedented. Dalton's jaw tightened. Pam knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't directly challenging him yet. She was laying the groundwork, forcing him to respond. The lawyers and law clerks in the gallery, who had been quietly waiting for their own cases, were now completely invested in the unfolding confrontation. Even the bailiff, who had probably witnessed thousands of hearings, shifted ever so slightly. Dalton took a slow breath. Ms. Bondi, this courtroom is not a stage for theatrics. If you have a legal argument, make it. Otherwise, the fine stands, and we move on. Pam smiled, almost knowingly. There it was. He'd opened the door. She adjusted her papers again, but this time she didn't look down. She kept her eyes locked on the judge. Very well, let's talk about Local Statute 14B, the one you claim I violated. She tapped her finger on the printed document in front of her. You say the law is clear, but that's interesting, because I happen to know that this very statute has been challenged numerous times over the past 5 years, with conflicting interpretations. Dalton's gaze sharpened. The language in subsection C, for example, Pam continued smoothly, almost conversationally, is so vague that it's been ruled unenforceable in at least 3 separate cases. And let's not forget that just last year, an appellate court ruled that issuing fines under this statute without due process is a direct violation of constitutional rights. The courtroom went completely silent. Pam could feel the shift in the room. Dalton could feel it too. He straightened, his tone growing sharper. Those cases don't apply here. Pam didn't hesitate. Don't they? She flipped to another page. Because from where I'm sitting, it seems they do. The ruling in Reynolds versus Clearwater made it very clear. An administrative fine issued without consideration of evidence is subject to reversal on procedural grounds. She let her words hang in the air before adding, and I'm sure Your Honor wouldn't want to ignore established precedent. Dalton clenched his jaw. Pam paused just long enough for the impact to be felt before delivering the next blow. Unless, of course, this court is prepared to disregard established case law. In that case, I'd be happy to file an appeal. Dalton leaned forward, folding his hands in front of him. Are you threatening this court with an appeal, Ms. Bondi? Pam exhaled through her nose, a quiet laugh escaping her lips. Your Honor, I don't make threats, I cite the law. A murmur rippled through the back of the room. Pam had done something subtle yet important. She had shifted the balance of power. She had forced the judge to defend his position rather than issue rulings without challenge. Dalton knew this too. The city attorney, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. Your Honor, if I may. Dalton raised a hand, silencing him. His gaze remained fixed on Pam. There was a long pause before the judge finally spoke. Very well. You may present your defense. Pam gave a small, measured smile. But she wasn't celebrating. Not yet. This was just the beginning. But before she could speak again, Dalton did something unexpected, something that made it clear this battle wasn't going to be easy. Without breaking eye contact, Judge Dalton leaned forward, his fingers laced together. Proceed, he said, his voice carrying a weight that felt less like permission and more like a challenge. Pam recognized the tactic instantly. This wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about control. Dalton wanted to make sure she understood her place in his courtroom, but Pam wasn't the type to be intimidated. She straightened, her expression unreadable. Let's begin with the language of the statute itself, she said, tapping her papers. Local Statute 14B states that any entity failing to comply with municipal regulations may be fined. Simple enough. But the real issue lies in how compliance is defined. The language is broad, vague, and inconsistent with constitutional due process protections. Dalton exhaled slowly, his expression indifferent. And yet, Ms. Bondi, this statute has been enforced repeatedly without issue. Pam tilted her head. That's curious because according to public records, at least 4 previous cases resulted in partial or full dismissals due to the very vagueness I'm highlighting now. She turned to the city attorney, then back to Dalton. Unless you'd like to argue that due process only applies when it's convenient. Dalton's grip on the bench tightened. Ms. Bondi, if your argument relies on vague procedural objections, I suggest you reconsider. The law is enforced as written. Pam allowed a beat of silence before responding. Except when it isn't. A murmur rippled from the back of the room. Pam reached for another document, holding it up. Let's talk about Henderson vs. the City of St. Petersburg. In that case, the defendant was fined under this very statute. Same wording, same enforcement method. But the appellate court ruled that the city's interpretation violated state-level protections. She paused for emphasis. You know what the judge said in that ruling? The law, as applied, fails to provide sufficient notice or clear standards for enforcement, making it unenforceable under scrutiny. Dalton's expression remained neutral, but the tension in his jaw spoke volumes. The city attorney shifted, uncomfortably. Your Honor, I believe we're getting off track. Pam cut him off, her gaze sharp. Counselor, I'd love to hear how you reconcile this ruling with the fine your office is trying to enforce today. The attorney hesitated, his silence speaking louder than words. Pam turned back to Dalton. Respectfully, Your Honor, I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for consistency. If a higher court has already determined that this statute is problematic, how does this court justify imposing a penalty under it? Dalton leaned back in his chair, calculating his next move. Pam knew exactly what he was doing, stalling, trying to regain control. Finally, he spoke. The circumstances of that case are not identical to yours. Pam didn't flinch. True, but the precedent applies all the same. The law is either clear or it isn't. The silence in the room had shifted. Pam had him cornered, not because he was wrong, though he was, but because she had forced him into a position where any decision now would come under scrutiny. Dalton could push forward, disregarding precedent and risking an overturned ruling, or he could backpedal, admitting that he had acted hastily. He let out a slow breath. Ms. Bondi, I find your interpretation debatable. Pam smiled, just slightly. Then let's debate it. Dalton's nostrils flared. To her surprise, he reached for his gavel. The court will take a 15-minute recess. He stood, and before anyone could object, he disappeared into his chambers. Pam sat still at the defense table, her hands resting lightly on the stack of papers in front of her. She wasn't reading them. She didn't need to. The precedents, the case law, the arguments were all firmly embedded in her mind. She was ready. But something about Dalton's abrupt recess didn't sit right with her. He wasn't the type to hesitate. He was either regrouping or preparing for something she hadn't anticipated. The door to the judge's chambers opened, and Dalton returned, this time with a new presence by his side. It was another judge. Judge Alan Whitaker, a senior judge, someone more experienced than Dalton. The moment Whitaker entered, the mood in the courtroom shifted. This wasn't standard procedure. Bringing in another judge mid-hearing wasn't just unusual. It was calculated. Pam adjusted her posture, her expression unreadable. Dalton cleared his throat. Before we continue, I've requested that Judge Whitaker sit in on this matter. Pam didn't believe for a second that this was just a request. Someone had pulled strings. As the tension in the courtroom deepened, Pam remained steady, her poise unwavering as she prepared for the next phase of the battle. The entry of Judge Alan Whitaker, a senior judge of considerable influence, only added to the weight of the situation. Pam recognized this moment as pivotal. The stakes were no longer just about the fine. This was a contest of power, strategy, and precedent. Whitaker, with his measured and calm presence, turned his attention to her. Ms. Bondi, he began, I understand you have raised significant procedural concerns regarding the enforcement of Statute 14b. Pam locked eyes with him, her response clear and confident. That's correct, Your Honor. Whitaker clasped his hands, leaning forward slightly. You believe this fine should be overturned based on appellate precedent? Pam didn't hesitate. I don't believe it. I know it. A faint murmur rippled through the courtroom as Judge Dalton's lips tightened. Whitaker raised an eyebrow. I admire your confidence, but let's go into specifics. You mentioned Henderson versus City of St. Petersburg. Are you aware that a later ruling clarified that certain interpretations of the statute could remain enforceable under local judicial discretion? Pam's expression stayed neutral, but internally, she recognized what was happening. This was a counterattack. By bringing in Whitaker, Dalton was hoping to leverage the judge's authority to undermine her position, perhaps using a technicality that might have slipped past her. I'm aware of that ruling, Your Honor. Pam responded evenly. But I also know that the same ruling emphasized that enforcement must adhere to strict evidentiary standards. And those standards haven't been met in this case. Whitaker nodded as if acknowledging that her point had merit. Let's talk about that then. The officer who issued the violation is present. Would you like to cross-examine him? Pam barely concealed her surprise but welcomed the opportunity. Yes, Your Honor, I would. A man stood from the back of the room, and Pam recognized him immediately. Officer Brian Calloway, a municipal enforcement officer. He was confident, exuding the demeanor of someone accustomed to having their decisions unquestioned. Pam approached the witness stand, her movements deliberate. Officer Calloway, can you confirm that you were the one who issued this violation? He nodded. Yes, ma'am. Pam turned slightly toward the gallery, her voice calm. And on what basis did you determine a violation had occurred? Calloway exhaled as if the answer was obvious. The statute is clear. The property in question wasn't in compliance with municipal code. I documented it and issued the fine. Pam clasped her hands behind her back, raising an eyebrow. Did you take any photographs of the alleged violation? He hesitated. No, ma'am. It wasn't necessary. A small, almost amused smile appeared on Pam's lips. You didn't document the violation, yet you issued a fine? Calloway shifted uncomfortably. I have years of experience. I didn't need a photo to confirm what I saw. Pam's mind raced, and she turned back toward the bench, her voice calm but firm. Your Honor, without photographic evidence, written statements, or any tangible proof, we are left with nothing but an individual's subjective assessment. This contradicts the evidentiary standards that were emphasized in the appellate ruling that Judge Whitaker referenced. Whitaker didn't change his expression, but Pam could feel the shift in the room. She had just exposed a flaw in the case. Judge Dalton's fingers drummed against the bench, signaling his frustration, but Pam wasn't done. She pressed forward. So, I ask again, Your Honor, how can this court justify imposing a fine when the statute lacks the necessary legal foundation for enforcement? The room fell silent. Dalton's tension was palpable, but Whitaker remained calm, not rushing to intervene. Pam knew she had cornered them. Dalton exhaled sharply. This court will take another recess. Pam resisted the urge to smile. She knew what was happening. Dalton was scrambling, trying to regain control of a situation that was slipping away from him. But the battle wasn't over yet. She had to remain vigilant. When the court reconvened, Dalton's demeanor had changed. The self-assuredness from earlier had vanished. He was visibly tense, almost resigned. Whitaker sat beside him, his posture neutral, giving no indication of his next move. Dalton cleared his throat. Ms. Bondi, you've presented compelling arguments. Pam raised an eyebrow, sensing the grudging respect in his tone. However, he continued, this court still finds the core issue remains unchanged. The fine stands. Pam blinked, caught off guard for a moment, but then exhaled, slowly collecting her thoughts. Then, if I may, she turned to the court stenographer. Could you please read back the last statement? The stenographer, quick and efficient, repeated Dalton's words. The fine stands. Pam turned back to Dalton. Your Honor, just to clarify, are you stating on record that a municipal fine can be imposed without evidentiary proof, in direct contradiction to established appellate precedent? Dalton's fingers twitched against the bench, but he didn't respond immediately. Ms. Bondi, he finally said, this court has discretion. Pam smiled slightly. It does. But discretion is not immunity from legal standards. The tension in the room was palpable. Pam's next words carried the weight of her argument. Let's put this in plain terms, Your Honor. If this ruling stands, it would set a precedent that any enforcement officer could issue a fine based solely on their word. No evidence, no documentation, just an assertion. Dalton's silence spoke volumes, and Pam pressed on. Imagine the implications of that. A business owner fined for something they can't verify. A homeowner penalized without the ability to challenge the charge. And the court? It would simply say, we have discretion. A few heads nodded in the gallery, and Pam turned back to Dalton. That's not discretion, Your Honor. That's unchecked authority. Whitaker, who had remained quiet, spoke up at last. You're arguing that allowing this fine to proceed without evidence would undermine due process? Pam nodded. Not just due process, Your Honor, but judicial integrity. Because if we allow rulings based on assertions rather than evidence, the foundation of our legal system starts to erode. Dalton's grip on the bench tightened, but he knew he had no real defense. The city attorney tried to interject, but Dalton held up a hand, signaling that the moment had passed. Finally, after a long pause, Dalton exhaled sharply. This court finds that the imposed fine does not meet the necessary evidentiary threshold for enforcement. His voice was tight, almost reluctant. The fine is overturned. A murmur rippled through the room. Pam allowed herself a small nod, but no celebration. The battle had been won, but the war wasn't over yet. Dalton's gavel struck the bench. Court adjourned. Pam gathered her papers, calmly tucking them into her folder. As she turned to leave, she caught Whitaker's gaze. His expression was unreadable, but Pam knew there was more to this than met the eye. Before she could leave, Dalton called after her. Miss Bondi. She turned to face him, and for the first time that day, she saw a glimmer of respect in his eyes. I underestimated you. Pam smiled slightly. You wouldn't be the first. She turned and walked out of the courtroom, heels clicking against the marble floor. But as she passed through the doors into the bright afternoon sunlight, she knew this victory was significant. She had not only won the case, but had also set a precedent that would echo far beyond this courtroom. As she neared the courthouse exit, she heard Whitaker's voice behind her. Ms. Bondi. Pam turned, surprised to see him approaching. His expression remained unreadable, but there was something in his gaze that hinted at something deeper. Something on your mind? She asked. Whitaker hesitated before speaking. You're good, Pam. She raised an eyebrow. I try. His eyes narrowed slightly. I wasn't brought in to observe. I was brought in to contain. Pam studied him for a moment, then smiled slightly. To contain what exactly? Whitaker looked at her for a long moment before speaking again. His voice lowered so only she could hear. Dalton doesn't like losing. This wasn't just about a fine, it was about setting an example. Pam already knew that. But hearing it from Whitaker only made the victory feel more substantial. She kept her voice even. So what happens now? Whitaker studied her for a moment, then gave her a look that held both respect and caution. You'll have people watching you, and not just here. Pam nodded. She understood. Today's victory had made her a target for those who didn't, like their authority questioned. But she also knew that she had done more than just win a case. She had made a statement, one that would resonate across the legal system. As Whitaker turned back toward the courtroom, Pam stepped toward the exit. The sun felt sharper, the air fresher. This wasn't her first courtroom battle, and it wouldn't be her last. But today, she had made sure that power wasn't just about who sat behind the bench. It was about standing firm when it counted, and she had done just that.